The Denver Broncos had several undrafted players who stood out during rookie minicamp, but because the Broncos roster is as strong as it is, will there be a strong chance for any of them to make the 53? We'll debate and discuss here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more every single day, all year long. This is the place to be. Special shout out to the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for tuning in, making us your first listen, however you choose to do so. If you're not yet an everydayer, you're just discovering us, make sure you become one so you never miss out. Hit that subscribe or that follow button wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll stay up to date on everything that's pertaining to your favorite team. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports.
And I'm Sayre Bedinger, site expert at predominantlyorange.com.
And today's episode, we're going to dive deep into the Broncos undrafted rookie free agent class. We had a chance to see them over the weekend at rookie minicamp. A couple of wide receivers, including Courtney Jackson, Joaquin Davis standing out. Interior offensive lineman Clay Webb receiving some high praise from Sean Payton. We'll discuss that, but we'll also go through some of the tryout players that were invited as well, including a safety from Colorado State that had a notorious hit on Travis Hunter, then they made up. We'll discuss how he looked initially in Saturday's practice, but we'll also talk about why the Broncos roster is more than likely going to change over the course of the next few days after the coaching staff evaluates the tape from rookie minicamp and what that might entail. You get all that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, which is brought to you by our friends over there at Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Sayre, let's go into the undrafted rookie free agent conversation. Now, initially when the draft finalized, we saw that the Broncos were working on agreements with several players. The 15 undrafted rookie free agents that they signed, that's kind of finalized here, but this list is obviously subject to change over the course of the next few days, which we'll dive deep into here as well. But let's go over some players who stood out. I mean, Sayre, we talked about a little bit in yesterday's rookie minicamp recap episode. I felt like the wide receiver position, there were three guys that stood out there. Courtney Jackson out of Arkansas State, Joaquin Davis out of North Carolina State, and then obviously Jerjuan Newton out of Toledo. All three of these guys, in my opinion, stood out, but it's hard to say whether or not these guys will have a chance to make the 53-man roster. I know Broncos Country wants us to answer that question.
Yeah, and I know that Sean Payton got asked some questions as well about some of these undrafted players, and I think you mentioned it with those wide receivers. I think it was Andrew Mason during the press conference, Cody, who noticed that Sean Payton, he said, hey, you were talking to Joaquin Davis. What was it that you were saying to him? And the first thing out of Sean's mouth was the special teams. He said, I just went through this whole thing about the kicking game, and then he said all of them, meaning all of those undrafted guys trying to prove themselves. He's like, it's just a handful of snaps that you get. It's getting them up to speed and then kind of going from there. He said they're moving guys around at the receiver position, not just isolating them at one spot. So I think that's kind of an interesting little nugget there when you think about how Sean is, hey, he might be, kind of already sort of favoring these guys. And then as we kind of touch on the last couple of years, Sean goes through this story that he tells about drafting a fourth-round running back in 2007 and this running back out of Ohio State. And he said, then this undrafted guy named Pierre Thomas out of Illinois outplays him, and they end up keeping the undrafted guy and cutting the fourth-round pick. That's kind of the message to all these guys that are participating here is, hey, Sean says it doesn't matter how you got here. What happens is that you get an opportunity now to compete, and we go by what we see. And that's something that he learned from Bill Parcells. And so these guys, they've got a legitimate opportunity here. They're not just roster, fodder at this point.
Well, and I think another thing that Sean pointed out that I think deserves attention here is that I think it really just says like, hey, nobody's spot really, even like, he talked about these undrafted guys. Even guys who are on the roster right now, their spot is not necessarily guaranteed outside of unless they're getting paid big money deals, they're already starters. That's fine. But like the guys who were depth players, rotational players, they're not safe. And when I look at wide receiver, it goes back to a conversation you and I had, I think, on last week's episode of the show. The more you see some of these guys here, like the Broncos already have, Michael Bandy on the training camp roster right now. Obviously he was a practice squad darling for the Broncos and for Joe Lombardi, but his spot essentially, like these guys are not only just trying to compete for a 53-man spot, but they're competing to impress to have a chance to be brought back onto the practice squad if they can't do it, if the Broncos just simply can't bring them onto the 53. And look, with the practice squad, you get that flexibility of being able to get called up, right? Called up and elevated. There's flexibility with that. I imagine that might change and get even better as the years go on here. But that's the biggest thing, is just the emphasis here on special teams. Like, you can play receiver, cornerback, linebacker, safety, D-line, but really try to make your hay on special teams. That's how you get noticed. There's not a lot of Vince Papales out there in the world, but come out there and make a name for yourself, be a special teams guy, and then everything else will fall into place here. That is where the Broncos view value. If you're not a starter, if you're a guy competing for a backup reps or rotational reps, how you do not only at your position, offensively or defensively, not only is that important, but how you do on the special team side, the core four, that's important. And I think you look at some of these guys that we mentioned, like the Joaquin Davises and obviously Courtney Jackson. I feel like Courtney Jackson, moves well. He's played against some big-time competition. I know he faced off this past season against Michigan standout cornerback Will Johnson, that ended up obviously dropping in the NFL draft due to injury concerns. But I thought he had an impressive day during Saturday's practice. Jerjuan Newton, once again, I think for a guy his size, he moves really well, really crisp. So I think that, guys like A.T. Perry, Trent Sherfield, Michael Bandy, I think all of these guys are going to be pushed during training camp. And I'm excited to see how it all plays out here. But I wanted to get to, linebacker as well. I mean, Sayre, there was obviously a linebacker that, I had my eye on during rookie minicamp on Saturday, and that is J.B. Brown, linebacker out of Kansas. And this is a guy who I felt like, moves well laterally. I thought he, very rangy there. I thought he's very smart in terms of what my initial impressions were of him. I thought he just picked things up quicker, than I anticipate for most undrafted guys. So that could mean more competition for Lavelle Bailey, who was an undrafted guy last year. So, I mean, you can never have enough options here. And there's guys that are going to emerge almost every season, though I do think it's hard. It's going to be hard this year for the Broncos to have an undrafted guy crack the 53 at the rate in which we've seen over the last couple of years, just because I think the roster is in a much better place.
Yeah, maybe it's somebody like Joaquin Davis who excels on special teams, making it over a guy like Trent Sherfield. You just never know. And that's why these guys go out there and compete and play. And I like that you mentioned J.B. Brown, Cody. We haven't touched a ton on this kind of stuff, but the amount that guys get in terms of guarantees when they come out as undrafted players, that usually is a telltale sign of, what's the team's plans with this guy. J.B. Brown, $150,000 in guarantees plus a $10,000 signing bonus. So that speaks volumes. Like $160,000 for an undrafted free agent. You're pushing pretty close to 7th round, 6th round pick territory in terms of guaranteed cash up front there. So there's a lot of guys that you look at and you say, hey, could you be the next Chris Harris? Who I think Chris Harris's signing bonus was like $2,000 or something crazy like that. It's one of the great stories out there. But then there's guys that are like, hey, we really believe that this guy can be something, so we have to kind of pay to keep him from going to other teams. I think that's fascinating. We also got some good clarity on Clay Webb. I know that there was a pretty lengthy discussion happening in the comments of one of our previous episodes asking about this guy, because you and I didn't really go into the details of his situation. He's been cleared legally as of April 2nd, according to our good friend Mike Kliss over there at 9 News, has a great post about all that stuff. And then Sean Payton actually confirmed that at the rookie minicamp when he was asked about Clay Webb, saying, yeah, he's been cleared. And he really gushed over this guy, Cody. I mean, he really was like, he was very complimentary. He talked about how great of a kid he is, or how great of a person he is, and how impressive he was in their meetings. So, I mean, Clay Webb, if we want to talk about guys who could, really stick on this roster and make it, he's kind of in a favorable position, because I don't think the backup center spot is locked in. I don't think backup guard spots are locked in. I think Clay Webb is a 3-year starter at left guard at Jacksonville State, former 5-star recruit at Georgia. This guy's got some skill, and if the coaching staff and the front office cleared him, if the ownership signed off on this kind of move, I think that's good news for him.
Yeah, and look, that's exactly what happened, because you and I initially questioned it, because I was very much like, hey, like this seems different than anybody that Sean's brought in terms of what he's talked about. But I would say this, being there, I was there for Sean when he said that. Ownership they did an extensive work. They did extensive background work with him. They worked with him. He told the story about everything that happened. He was up front with it, so he's getting an opportunity, and it's it's going to take some time for him to repair his image, I think, regardless of that. But when you look at what he did in terms of the Senior Bowl, I mean, Sayre, he's working great in one-on-ones against some really good prospects that got drafted this upcoming season. I couldn't help but think like, oh, Quinn Minor's situation, maybe all over again, except, this is a guy who didn't get drafted, though he did have a draftable grade on him. The character stuff, I think, dropped him out, obviously, of that conversation initially, but teams do their extensive background work on that. And if the Broncos say he's clear, then I think at this point we just have to trust in that. But he's one of those guys that I thought like, okay, there could be an uproot, whether it be at center, could even Ben Powers potentially be one of those guys. It's like not necessarily guaranteed. I don't know about that, but it's certainly worth talking about at this point here. But Broncos country, we want to know your thoughts on the undrafted rookie free agents. Is there anybody in your opinion that you wanted to hear a little bit about more? We'll go deeper into details about that, but also the Broncos had some tryout players, including former Colorado State safety Henry Blackburn. He got an opportunity to be on the field, and he looked impressive in his tryout. We'll dive deeper to that and much more here on today's episode of Locked On Broncos.
Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends Monarch Money. You ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? I'm with you on that, because between dining out, online shopping, which is my addiction, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. And that is where Monarch Money comes into play. It's your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances.
Now, tell me about it, Sayre. I stress out all the time, when I check my bank account, like, wait, where did that go? What did I spend money on this time? Well, Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center where you can track all of your accounts, all of your investments, and spending in one place. So you stop just managing your money and you start building wealth.
Well, my family and I are going to Disney World, so this app has come in super, super clutch, obviously. And instead of juggling multiple apps, with Monarch Money, you get that all-in-one convenience, right? You can use Monarch to check your finances, track all your spending, which can make me, sweat a little bit at times, and even plan those long-term goals or get ready for those big-time vacations.
Well, take control of your finances with Monarch Money today. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Yes, 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. Monarch Money.
The Denver Broncos holding some tryouts over the weekend for players who impressed enough to the point that Sean Payton said, we might have some guys that we can take to training camp. And Cody and I were going to speculate, who could that be? Who stood out at the Broncos rookie minicamp, at least for one of the days of practice? We're going to tell you exactly that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos and Broncos Country. Thank you so much for making us your first listen of the day every single day. We really appreciate you rocking with us all throughout the offseason. Your boys, Cody and Sayre, have you covered every single day. So if you haven't already done so, hit subscribe. We really appreciate you taking a couple of seconds to do that. And you won't miss an episode, right? And you won't miss when we talk about every player, not only on the roster, but guys trying out to make the roster, right, Cody? I think that there were some big names. There was a question about Desmond Ridder. Sean Payton said, he might be looking into some other things outside of his football career right now. So Desmond didn't show up, but former Sean Payton, actually kind of crazy. The last quarterback that Sean Payton drafted in New Orleans shows up at his Denver Broncos camp as a tryout player, which is fascinating to me, because now you've got the first round quarterback that he's ever taken in the building as well. So, but tell me what you saw out there, because I think that everybody's kind of expecting the bigger name guys to be standouts, but you mentioned a safety out of Colorado State that he's made some waves in the rivalry game with Colorado for other reasons there. How did these guys look to you?
Yeah, look, there were a handful of guys, and it varied. You had some Division I guys, some JUCO guys invited in terms of rookie tryouts. They had 29 players in for rookie tryouts. Henry Blackburn, safety out of Colorado State. Everyone knows for obviously CU versus CSU, he had the hit on Travis Hunter, and he received a lot of backlash for that hit. This is a guy, he plays tough. He's a chippy player, got a chip on his shoulder. But I think, Travis Hunter was like, no, because this is a kid who was receiving death threats because of what had happened, like the hit on Travis. And he and Travis literally buried the hatchet. They went bowling together. Like Travis shot, a little video documentary about these guys, hey, it's football. We're cool off the field, stuff like that. So that was cool to see. But we got a chance to take a look at him during rookie mini camp where he played the safety position. And you can definitely see he's a smart, instinctual football player. I think he makes up for what he lacks in terms of overall speed. You definitely see that physicality there. but he understands, I think, where to align to give him, an advantage against different splits. If he's has to play middle of the field against a trips formation to the right side of him, it's just about being in a smart position. Can I cover anything going vertical or across without taking myself out of a play? I think you see that. He's very communicative there, but it's going to be hard to see right now at the safety position, Sayre, because look, these tryout guys, they really have to impress, I think, in order to get an OTA training camp invite, because you're looking at guys who are drafted. You're looking at guys who were signed as undrafted free agents. The path isn't necessarily easy. So for these guys, it's an opportunity. And even if it doesn't happen in Denver, it's not necessarily a dead end for them. So Henry Blackburn, he wore number 35, 6 foot, 205 pounds. Maybe a name to keep an eye on here as well, but there are also a couple pro tryouts. You brought up Ian Book. I thought running back Chris Evans, number 25, I even posted in my video report there. People got to see him move a little bit. I think he moves well for a guy who last year, I know he suffered a torn patellar tendon that kept him out all season. I think former 6th-round draft pick of the Cincinnati Bengals. Could be a guy that just comes in and maybe spruces things up a little bit. I found it interesting, though, Sayre, because we had talked about it. I saw something out there initially a couple of weeks ago that Blake Watson was going to be at Broncos rookie minicamp. I didn't see him. there. So they might have just said like, hey, like Blake doesn't have to prove anything. I don't know. But to me, that was an interesting thing to hear that was going to happen. But aside from that, I would say really Henry Blackburn was probably the one guy that stood out in my opinion, in terms of the rookie tryout players.
And that's going to be a pretty loaded battle at the safety position if he does end up making the 90-man roster, right? Because then, I mean, you've got so many guys. We got the 2 entrenched starters. You got last year's starter in PJ Locke. You've got JL Skinner, the team loves, Devin Key, Keydron Smith, all these guys getting action last year. So that's going to be a tough one to crack. And I think that certainly you're looking at, hey, this guy might not be might not be talking about 53-man roster right now. We might be talking about, practice squad, 53-man down the line, right? Those are investments that these teams are making now. And Sean Payton's philosophy has always been, we don't want to have these guys at our camp, on our practice fields, and then all of a sudden down the line after letting them go, be wondering, what the heck did we miss? Like, why is he excelling at this team and not ours? The only example that I can think of since he's been in Denver of that is Emmanuel Wilson, who was at the rookie minicamp a couple of years ago. And I think he's the running back 2 now with the Green Bay Packers. So that was a guy that maybe one that got away from Sean Payton, especially because that's a position of need.
They also had Jalil, I think.
Did they really? I mean,
yeah.
That would make sense.
I think was that Sean's first year in Denver? Was that 2023?
Yeah.
So it was. I think it was because Jalil McLaughlin stood out. I think that was really probably it.
Yeah,
like if Jalil didn't stand out, I think Emmanuel probably would have made it.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And certainly that's something that you maybe even something as small as that, you can kick yourself, because I think the story that he told about even just the Pierre Thomas, I know it's not exactly the same, but the story that he told about how it was like 4 or 5 years later, they're in the NFC Championship game and Pierre was back to return a kick and he returns it out to the 40 and then he converts a 4th and 1 later in that game. And he's like, man, you don't realize in the moment when you're at the rookie minicamp necessarily that it's these guys that you're making these decisions on. You almost a split decision, you're letting them out of the building. I think Chris Evans specifically even has a tryout with, I think the Philadelphia Eagles maybe lined up or something like that. Somebody else besides Denver. But you're making these decisions understanding that the ripple effect could be substantial down the line. What's the 4-yard kickoff return 4 years from now? What's the 4th and 1 4 years from now? Who's going to be those guys to step up for you? That's what the Broncos are trying to find out. Not to make any mountains out of molehills, right? It's rookie minicamp, but at the same time, this is where you get that tape, like you said, and you make those roster adjustments.
Yeah, and look, you mentioned the butterfly effect. That is a very, very real thing, and it's not something you realize or that you see until later on, right? And then everyone's like, "Oh, hindsight is 20/20." You only know what you know in the moment, and there's so many different factors that go into that decision-making process about your roster. Maybe you're not in a position to keep 4 running backs or 5 running backs or 6 wide receivers, but you have to make a choice, and a guy gets signed by another team in the roster cut process, but you really wanted to bring him back. Like all of these things can happen and certainly have happened over the course of time. There was another rookie tryout player that stood out to me, at inside linebacker. Now, we mentioned an undrafted rookie free agent that obviously was signed by the team, but this guy was a rookie tryout player, and it's Jordan Turner. We're number 54, 6'1" inside linebacker, 231 pounds. I thought he moved well. Like, this is a guy that I felt like kind of fit that mold there. Like, this guy, he's got the height to be able to see over the line of scrimmage at a pretty decent rate, but he's just fast. He's reading the guard quickly. If it's a run play, he's filling exactly where he should go in his gaps. When it's coverage, he's rangy, moves very quickly, lateral side to side, gets good depth. That's one thing I noticed about him. And so you have to ask yourself, in a situation like that, does this have any kind of bearing on, what you decide to do? Is there a change? Like, Denver could bring in an additional rookie tryout guy by upending a potential undrafted guy that is already signed. And Broncos country, that's exactly what we're going to get into our conversation here as we get ready to wrap up today's episode of the show. Over the next couple of days, I would say to expect the Broncos to make a couple of roster moves in terms of maybe moving off of a couple of undrafted guys for some tryout players who shined over at rookie minicamp. We'll debate and discuss what that looks like. Plus, can Sean Payton, is he going to look at keeping a fourth quarterback? We'll debate and discuss here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Gear up for the fourth quarter of today's episode of the show, Broncos Country, as we dive deep into what we think is going to happen this week with some anticipated roster moves for the Broncos before the NFL schedule release, which happens on Wednesday. You'll get complete coverage of that as well all throughout the week here, Locked On Broncos. With that said, I want to say thank you once again to everyone in Broncos Country, all the everydayers. Thanks for tuning in, making us your first listen, however you choose to do so. You make the show exactly what it is. We're so grateful for you. So make sure you interact with people in the YouTube comments or on social media. Get involved in the conversation of your favorite Broncos podcast. So, Sayre, let's continue on here. I think that we can expect the Broncos to make a couple of roster decisions over the next couple of days here. Now, initially last week, this is something we didn't really get to have a chance to touch on here. But the Broncos released two veteran players. They released veteran punter Matt Hack and then obviously long snapper Zach Triner, who they had signed in the offseason in free agency. And now it's kind of created a way for them to be roster compliant because they were at 92 players at that time. Now they're at the perfect spot. I think they're at 91 with Thomas Yasmin, who was also at rookie minicamp, as kind of a second-year player. He was involved in the mix. But I expect there to be some other moves made here. Let's touch on, obviously, those veteran moves here, and then we'll get into maybe what some of the undrafted moves could be.
Well, I think you have one of the highest paid long snappers in the league, right? Mitchell Fraboni, who you re-signed this offseason. That's a no-brainer. So if he's healthy and ready to go, because I know they only signed the other guy because there was an injury that Fraboni was dealing with.
He had back surgery.
Back surgery, right? So that, thankfully, this is good news, right? It means that he's going to be ready to go. And then obviously you drafted a punter. You're the only team to draft a punter, Jeremy Crawshaw, in the 6th round, and you're buying into that guy. Like, I know there might be growing pains, there might be rookie struggles, but when you draft a punter, you're bought in for at least a year, right? Unless it gets really, really bad. And then you might, scour the waiver wire later. But at least for week 1, I think we can now count that as, what the Broncos are looking at, which is a good plan. And I think that when you have special teams kind of solidified like that going into camp, it's a big advantage, in my opinion. Don't steal reps from a rookie punter, especially. Don't fabricate. What did we talk about this with last year on special teams? I can't remember what it was, but it's like, don't fabricate these position battles at, in the offseason when you're just stealing reps from somebody. And that's ultimately the Broncos realize we can't do that for our punter.
Well, and part of me is also wondering it as well. Like, what positions can you get away with that? I think anytime you can add to the secondary, linebacker, even interior offensive line, I always think those are good position battles to have. Running back, tight end. Seems like there's going to be a lot of competition there. But in terms of like the roster shuffling that I do expect to have happen here in the next couple of days, Sean even alluded to it in his post-practice press conference on Saturday that they're going to get a full wide picture of these 3 days of practices, and every rep, every position is filmed, and they're going to go through it, and they're going to go through their players that they signed as undrafted guys. They're going to look at the tryout players, and they may change like, okay, hey, we signed this undrafted guy, but this tryout player just did what we wanted him to do a little bit more, stood out a little bit more, and then they may make some of those changes. So I would expect a couple of moves to happen. I don't expect there to be any widespread moves, but we'll see how things kind of go in that department here. But then I think even going into it another length here, let's talk about this because there obviously was the quarterback tryout. They had a rookie tryout at quarterback, but Ian Book, obviously getting that pro tryout here. Denver already has 3 quarterbacks on the roster. Bo Nix, Jarrett Stidham, your unquestioned starter and backup on this team. Sam Ehlinger, just another guy that you have there. Will we see a 4th quarterback on this roster, in your opinion? With a guy like Ian Book coming into the mix here, is it something the Broncos need, in your opinion? I personally feel like they don't need it because, hey, you're going to have 3 quarterbacks as is. That's what the Broncos had initially last year. Why? And we were already counting reps between those guys. If Bo's your starter, Jarrett's your backup, and that's unquestioned, to me, it makes no sense to bring in another quarterback.
Yeah, that's a tough, because I don't know exactly how reps get divvied up during practices, especially during this point of the offseason, right? I think the only benefit that I can see to bringing in a 4th quarterback is we want to get the best possible look for the other guys that are on the roster at that deep down the depth chart, right? We want to get, okay, when the undrafted receivers are coming up in line, we don't want it to be some guy that doesn't know what he's doing out there. Not that Sam Ehlinger is that, but maybe a rookie would be. So that's where you'd say, hey, let's throw Book out there. Sean drafted him. I mean, maybe there's a little bit of something there. So, but I'm with you. I think if you have a 3rd quarterback already, like Sam Ehlinger should be able to give your guys a good enough look, right? That's what I'm thinking. So he's going to be your preseason guy. We're going to see a lot of him during the preseason, I bet. So that's kind of where I would come down on it. It's unless it's about upside, right? If you feel like, man, this guy could get us something in a trade down the line if he has a great preseason. That was the rationale with Desmond Ridder, right? That's what I was kind of thinking. So that would be the only thing that I could see, but I'm kind of with you on that one, Cody. I think there's no real reason to say, hey, we need a 4th quarterback to come in. We need to wedge some reps in for this guy or whatever, unless he was really that impressive and you felt like, man, he could be an asset to our room.
We already know the Broncos are going to rotate some of these younger guys at wide receiver, running back in with the first team offense. It's something that Sean always does. So some of these guys are going to get a chance to work with Bo Nix, but also I think it's going to be good for them to work with Jarrett Stidham in that 2nd team offense. You're getting a different look. You're getting an experienced veteran quarterback that's also throwing you the football. I think that can maximize your looks. And look, you're going to get that same rotation defensively where you're going to get a multitude of different guys, whether you're 2nd, 3rd, 4th team. You're going to get some of those guys that are going to be in the mix there that I think are ultimately going to help with the roster evaluation process during the offseason program. Maybe there's a possibility where we could see, I think maybe Ian Book brought into OTAs, maybe not necessarily training camp, but OTAs in a sense. I could see that. And do the Broncos look at Ehlinger and Book? And is there any kind of decision that they need to make there? Or is it more so like, hey, we already view Sam Ehlinger as that number 3 quarterback who we hope will likely be our practice squad guy. And this, certainly, with Ian Book, where did he recently? I think he spent his last 2 teams he spent time with was Kansas City and the Eagles, 2 teams that were just in the Super Bowl. So, maybe there's something that he's learned in terms of value there. I'm not sure, but I mean, ultimately, it's hard to evaluate, and that's one thing I wanted to highlight too, especially at rookie minicamp. I got a lot of Broncos fans asking me about D-line, offensive line, edge rushers, and I will be honest with you, minicamp, when there's no pads and there's no contact allowed, it is so hard to evaluate because you're not allowed to have that physical contact. It's not like what you're going to see when training camp comes on. So really, these are the positions that right now, when you're asking me, I can't give you an honest evaluation on it just because we don't the data and the sample size is very skewed and limited at this point. So training camp's going to have to be that forte, which Sayre actually have some bad news for Broncos country as it pertains to the first week of training camp. It's going to be earlier this year than usually it is. So, of course, as you all know, I'm getting married, and then I'm going on my honeymoon with my fiance. We're going to Italy for 2 weeks, and I had timed it out okay, if training camp starts at the normal time it does every year, I will maybe only miss 1 day. It starts earlier this week, so I'm going to miss the first week of training camp, which, it's rough, but you know what? I'm on my honeymoon. We'll have you take things, cover things and keep Broncos country posted. But dang, I know it's one of those things that I found out over the weekend. I was just like, oh man, all right. Now we're going to have to adjust to that. But Broncos country, this will still be the place to be. But yeah, I had to throw that out there.
Yeah, it's, one of those things to where the off season rests for no one, right? It's like, hey, I'm going to Disney World and the schedule releases while we're there. So, all right, we're bringing the gear, we're bringing the stuff to Disney World, right? So I get it. And that's why, we say your boys, Cody and Sayre, we got you covered at all times with everything that goes on Denver Broncos. So I'm excited to see how all these competitions play out, Cody, and I'm excited to see which guys do get signed, because I agree with you. There's going to be roster shuffling. There's going to be players that are getting, swapped in and out. And I'll be fascinated to see if there's any free agent signings coming up, because I know no more do the free agents count against the compensatory formula. And there's still guys out there that are looking for jobs. And we know that deadlines spark action. So as you get into the meat of the offseason program where veterans start showing up, now you might get into that area where, hey, the Broncos bring some guys in.
Could Nick Chubb somehow maybe get a chance to, participate in Denver? I mean, certainly a talking point, a possibility at this point, but we'll go through all that Broncos country as time goes on. The next time we'll be able to see the Broncos at practice a couple weeks from now, OTAs continue on, minicamp begins, and then it's go time. This is the place to be. But Broncos country, for all you everydayers, here's what you can expect on tomorrow's show. With the NFL schedule release coming up on Wednesday, we'll have coverage of that. I'm going to take a shot here at predicting the schedule here. And if Sayre's able to do it, he's on his way. He's going to be on his way to Disneyland. So if he's got a chance to jump on, he and I will both share our predictions, and you can share yours as well. And we're excited to see how close or how far off we get on some of the matchups, number of primetime games, and a lot more. It's going to be a fun, jam-packed week over here. Locked On Broncos with us at Broncos Country. We'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the show.